Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I want to begin by saying that I'm so incredibly proud and honored, really, to be the rabbi of a synagogue that has a Veterans Day Shabbat. If you've been a member only of Agudas Achim here in San Antonio, you might assume that every shul recognizes their veterans with a special Shabbat, but unfortunately that isn't always the case. So again, I want to thank everyone who contributed to this beautiful and important event, specifically to the Sisterhood of Agudas Achim. Thank you to our veterans, and thank you to everyone who served our country. Many of you know this. I grew up on a military base, Fort Hood, now called Fort Cavazos. My great-grandfather was a general in the United States Army, and his son, my grandfather, was the brigadier general of Fort Hood in the 1970s. And essentially all of my family is buried here in San Antonio at the Veterans Cemetery at Fort Sam Houston. Growing up next to a military base was interesting. Obviously, it's all I knew, so I never really thought too much about it. But there's an interesting phenomenon when you're a kid on Fort Hood and you make friends with other kids whose parents are in the Army. You oftentimes don't get to know them very well because most things in the U.S. Army are kind of temporary, meaning that Billy, who moved down the street from you, might only be in your neighborhood for 6 to 8 months before his parents were deployed to the next base. So you're kind of forced to learn at a young age that friendships and life itself is a bit fleeting. It was also unusual because Fort Hood's entire economy seemingly revolved around the base. So everyone knew when it was payday because all the restaurants and, yes, bars were packed. Everyone knew when the 1st Cavalry Division was set to deploy because all the pawn shops would fill up with all the toys that the GIs had bought that they couldn't take with them to Afghanistan or Iraq. And then when all the soldiers did deploy, the community felt like a ghost town. There was a lot less traffic, a lot less commotion, a lot less wait at those restaurants, a lot less friends moving down the street. But then it would be like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly there would be an influx of soldiers that came back to base. And then it was like, party on! There were flashy cars and motorcycles everywhere. Everybody got married. Good times. Another thing that was weird about growing up on base was that because my grandfather was such a dynamic figure in the community, and because my last name is somewhat distinct, Hodson, often people would associate me with him basically wherever I went. My grandfather served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The military was his life. The story goes that he was studying for his exams at West Point when his mother, my great-grandmother, called to inform him that his older brother, who was a fighter pilot in World War II, had been shot down by the Japanese overseas. "What are you going to do about it?" she insisted. According to now legend, he immediately went down to the registration office at West Point and officially dropped out of school. He afterwards went down to the local recruiter, enlisted in the United States Army, and years later, when he made the rank of general, he earned the moniker of Mustang, meaning one who didn't graduate from West Point but still made general, something that doesn't happen often. Growing up in a military town, I always felt like I was living the life of a real-life G.I. Joe. My dad used to drive around my grandfather's Oldsmobile, which, like my grandfather, seemed to be bulletproof. That thing wouldn't die. It still had the general sticker proudly displayed on the bumper. So anytime we went through the gate onto base, the MPs, the military police, would salute us. I thought this was really cool as a kid. When I got older, one time I took a girl on a date. I used that Oldsmobile. She wasn't particularly impressed with the car itself, but she did think it was pretty cool when a bunch of young guys saluted me when we drove on the base for no real reason, other than for them to salute me. Sometimes when I was around town and people would see on my ID that my last name was Hodson, or if they would hear my last name, they'd stop me and they'd say, "Are you related to the General Hodson?" And when I nodded yes, inevitably they would launch into a story about him, things he did or said or battles that they were in with him. And this was kind of cool, but also slightly traumatic for a kid, because usually they'd say something like, "He was a tough SOB. When he told you to go, you went. But I'll tell you one thing, son, I'd go through hell for that old man." This was my childhood growing up, hearing stories of this everywhere. I think about that quote often. They used to say, "When he told you to go, you went." I think about that because, believe it or not, that is the sentiment of this week's Torah portion, Lecha. The words Lecha are usually translated as "go for yourself." And they are spoken by God to Abraham, or Abram in this instance. He hasn't changed his name yet. And the words instruct Abraham that he is to go forth from his native land and go to a land that God will show him. Really, this is the first migration of the Jewish people. Abram and his wife Sarai, who later becomes Sarah. This is the first instance of a Jewish family moving from one place to the next. And the story starts off a bit rocky. They go down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, and Pharaoh takes Sarai. He tries to keep her. Then we go through the politics and the internal family bickering that most Jewish families experience, even ones around nowadays. And I think the reason that the story has resonated with audiences for so long, it's because I think each of us have had our own Lecha moments. We've all had that first time away from home. Maybe for you it was the first night you went to college, or the first time you moved into your own apartment away from mom and dad. Lecha is important because it's relatable. Sometimes life demands that we go. And when that happens, it's up to us to heed the call and to go for ourselves. I consider myself very lucky to have grown up in a family that has military lineage, because if there's any group of people that understands what it means to heed the call to go, to Lecha, it's military veterans and their families. My grandfather answered the call when my great-grandmother said to him, "What are you going to do about it?" Obviously, she could have said things differently. But I think about, without her initiating my grandfather's call to action, I wonder if I would have heard all of those war stories about him growing up. Friends, since October 7th, the amount of former IDF soldiers who have volunteered to go back into reserve duty and serve the country of Israel is staggering. Likewise, the amount of people who have decided to make Aliyah, become Israeli citizens and participate in their armed services, those people who have decided to heed the call of Lecha and return home, it's likewise incredible. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about heeding the call to action is God tells Abraham that during this journey that God won't abandon him. He says, quote, "You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." Friends, this is also the promise that God has made to us numerous times throughout the Torah. If we follow God's rules and truly obey, if we heed the call to have our own Lecha moment, then we too will be a blessing. So this morning, I feel like I should ask you, what is God calling on you to do? Where is the place that God will show you? Perhaps this is finally starting the next chapter of your life that you've been putting off, or maybe this is literally moving or relocating. Maybe it's going back to school or reconnecting with a lost friend or loved one. Whatever your Lech Lecha moment is, please know that the God of Israel will be with you when you do it, and you will be a blessing. In conclusion, again, I want to thank our veterans and their families. God bless you. God bless our synagogue. God bless America. Shabbat Shalom.